a very brief contribution to this important bill. I have a large number of colleagues who are very keen to make their contribution, and I preemptively acknowledge them. But in particular, I'd like to preemptively acknowledge the contribution that will shortly follow from the member for Burns Beach. As a former police officer, he is a fierce advocate for the needs of WA Police in this House and in his work, and in particular his work around PTSD and providing support. So I'd like to acknowledge that. I'm not going to go into the technical details of this bill. That will be covered in consideration in detail, but I want to come at this from a slightly different perspective from my own experience as a partner of a serving police officer, and what this bill will mean for not only serving officers and former officers, but also their dependents and family members. It's 10 years ago, almost exactly, that my husband graduated from the WA Police Academy up in Joondalup. That represented a lifelong ambition for him to serve his community, and one that he was very proud to achieve. He absolutely loved the job. He served as a general duties officer in Gosnells, Wyndham in the Kimberley. He went on to be a youth crime intervention officer in Kalgoorlie, and later, when we briefly relocated to Tasmania to support my sister through some health issues, he joined Tasmania Police as well and served there. I remember very clearly when he started at Gosnells, the stories that he would tell coming home, the usual, "How was your shift, honey?" And there were all sorts of interesting answers. One day he came home and showed me a photo of a smashed fence, and I said, "Oh, how did that happen?" He said, "Oh, I ran through it." I said, "No, you didn't." He said, No, I ran through it." I said, "Why would you do that?" "Oh, I realised it was easier for me to go through it than over." Yeah, he would tell stories about running over rooftops, tasering offenders, having different types of weapons pulled, having cars drive at him from the wrong side of the road. And yet, strangely, despite the risk that's evident in the stories that he would tell me, when people ask me, are you worried about your husband? Are you worried about him? I would truthfully answer no. And the reason for that answer was that I had what I realise now is a false belief that his training, his instinct and his judgment could protect him from physical harm. So I put my faith in him, and I also believed strongly in the important job that he was doing. I was aware of the psychological harm. I was alert to that because it would manifest in our house in different ways. He would come home and perhaps be short-tempered, grumpy, perhaps speak in a tone of voice that indicated to me that it was a time to suggest that he go for a surf. And he was very responsive to that support at home, and managed personally very well that kind of pressure. But the physical risk was something that I diminished. Until one day I was at work and I received a text message, and it just contained a photo. And it was a photo of my husband in the back of an ambulance sucking on the magic green whistle. And my first reaction to that photo was not to wonder what had happened, it was actually anger. And it wasn't anger at what I'll share shortly the story, but it was actually anger at him. I was angry because this belief that I had put in his ability to stay safe had just in that moment been shattered. And I realise now that was my coping mechanism as a family member. And it was the story I told myself to protect myself from the risk that he engaged in on a daily matter, on a daily basis. So what had happened is that he was on a special secondment and operating undercover, and had turned up to a job. And unrelated to that job, they saw a prolific offender that had been wanted for a period of time, a prolific family domestic violence offender, a pretty nasty character. And when this character spotted them and instantly recognised them as police, despite the fact they're undercover, this offender was in a vehicle and he put the car in reverse in an attempt to escape. He had 2 young children in the back of the vehicle, and a woman was standing in the passenger doorway with the door open. When this vehicle was put in reverse, the woman was dragged under the vehicle and under the door and under the vehicle. The police officers, including my husband, jumped out and tried to stop this happening. Temporarily, the offender stopped the vehicle, and my husband made a decision to jump into the open passenger door in an attempt to stop this offender from continuing with these two young children in the back of the vehicle. The offender proceeded to then continue to drive, and as the car accelerated in speed and my husband was half in and half out, he had to make the decision, the split-second decision. Does he try to remain in the vehicle or does he eject himself out of it? And he made the decision to eject himself out of the vehicle, and in doing so obviously hit the curb, did a few bounces, and in that process smashed up his wrist, broke his leg, obviously concussion and bruises, but really was very lucky given the circumstances to not experience a serious head injury. So that was the circumstances of his incident, and it was his very last day on the job, as it would turn out. He wouldn't know that at the time as he was taken off in that ambulance, that he would actually never put a uniform on again. It wasn't the nature of his injury in itself that stopped him from continuing in the police force, but it's certainly that experience of having your confidence shattered as a family member and as a partner was pretty devastating for our family. We returned to WA, and so his injury was part of the conversation about the risk that police officers face when they're in the job. Now, his accident occurred while he was serving for Tasmania Police. Had it occurred when he was serving for WA Police, he would not have been eligible for workers' compensation. I'm really proud that now this bill addresses that inequity, that police officers across this country, some received workers' compensation and in WA our police force did not. I've got this moment to acknowledge the service of my husband, because he didn't have the opportunity, leaving as he did in the back of the ambulance, to have the standard farewells. So I would like to acknowledge his service and say on record how proud I am of the work that he did and his contribution to the community, both in Western Australia and Tasmania. In the same vein, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of all serving and former police officers. Their work is tough. We know that. We know that they face risk in their work every day. So I would like to thank them for the very, very important tasks that they do and for the risks that they take on behalf of our community. So I would also like to acknowledge the Police Minister for bringing this bill to the House, and the former Minister for Police for her contribution to this bill as well, and to put on record how important it is that this bill for police officers, but also their family, their dependents, and the people that rely on them. So I commend this bill to the House.
Hear, hear.